By saying it's my MBA business, I basically gave myself permission for the first 3 years to just focus on learning. And getting paid anything to learn is great when you compare it to an MBA where you're paying to learn.
That's Layla Pomper, the founder of ProcessDriven, a company that helps small teams clean up their operations so they can turn their messy chaos into control. Layla has bootstrapped ProcessDriven to over $250,000 in annual revenue and over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. But the funny thing is that ProcessDriven was not supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be just a business that she has for maybe 2 or 3 years. Well, 7 years later, and Layla still hasn't applied for a new job. So in this episode, we go over the mindset that helped Layla grow ProcessDriven initially, the 3 different chapters or pivots of ProcessDriven, and how Layla has used YouTube to grow ProcessDriven. But before we dive into all of ProcessDriven, let me give you a little bit of context of what Layla was doing before she started ProcessDriven. Let's go back to 2017 and Layla lands her dream job, but everything is terrible. So here's Layla to explain why the dream job wasn't actually the dream.
I had landed kind of like my dream job in this small fintech firm. I was going to, transition overseas. It was all I'd ever wanted to work internationally. And it was just everything I wanted coming true at once. And I realized everything about that sounded terrible. And I talked to my manager and they're like, hey, don't worry. In 3 to 5 years, you'll get into this position that'll have some interest. And I basically listened to that performance review and realized I don't want to wait 3 to 5 years to enjoy what I spend the majority of my life doing. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to go get 3 to 5 years experience some other way. And I quit with no plan. And ultimately, when I looked on the job market, I realized everything that was fun required 3 to 5 years of experience. And so I decided to start something. It's been 7 years now. I'm still doing the same business that I started 7 years ago. And I think what ended up happening is I fell in love with, it's cheesy, like the process. Like I kept learning. 2 years in, I was like, oh, I'm not done. I just learned this new thing that I don't know. And then I went 2 more years and, oh, what about this? And business became so much more of an education than any PhD could have or anything else.
So I love Layla's mindset here of treating it as more of like an educational experience rather than this like, oh crap, like I need to go make a ton of money. I need to make my full-time income. And because it doesn't turn into this existential crisis, it allows you to really build more freely and build the right thing rather than like the thing that you need to go build just to make money, right? There's a big difference between being able to build something that like allows you to kind of match your passions and the money making versus like, oh, this is the quick buck type of thing. And also, right, in this mindset, you're also able to kind of run like these mini experiments a lot easier too, right? Because instead of like, oh, this experiment needs to absolutely land, it's more of like, oh, let me run this experiment and let's see what happens, rather than like, oh, like this experiment, like here's like, it has like a 75% chance of really making some real money. So in this kind of mindset, right, you're really experimenting for the exploration's sake, and you're doing it also for money, but not necessarily aiming for perfection where like that's probably what you're trying to do if you really like need the funds to go do things. And there's a place for that, but hopefully, right, when you're building your own bootstrap business, like that's not the mentality. So Layla has this mindset of like, hey, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna experiment a lot, I'm gonna see what like it's gonna work. I'm gonna do whatever I think is helpful to others. And some of it might not be the things I want to do. And as right, Layla mentioned, she's like an overqualified virtual assistant, but still, right, she has this experimental mindset of like, hey, this isn't forever. I'm just gonna go see and what plays out. So how did that all play out? Here's Layla to explain.
It was messy. I was, the first time founder. I had like a little nest egg I'd saved for my job out of college and working through college. And then I just had hustle. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have any like durable skills. I did so many things wrong, but it still worked. So if anyone else is in that boat, like you can still make it too. How did I approach it? Really, I tried to look at what I really enjoyed in my jobs in college. You mentioned like F&M options, like I started a club. What were the things I enjoyed doing and I did really well? And what did the people local to me need? It was very, very transactional. My goal was, again, just 2 to 3 years of experience. Didn't matter what I did as long as I was learning from it. And so I ended up entering the marketplace as like a virtual assistant, a very overqualified virtual assistant. My first gigs were things like, you know, some bookkeeping work, organizing files, setting up software like Dubsado. I mean, those were kinds of the projects that I first got into. And my first clients, which I think is always the hardest part, my first clients became from those cringy local networking events that I am so glad to move past now, but I think we've all been there. Yep, that was my first clients.
So this process of just taking on pretty much every type of project imaginable, and yes, like Layla is an overqualified virtual assistant, but this ended up working out pretty well, especially economically, but also I would argue even educationally. Yes, like there's things that she was definitely overqualified for, but like all these little things of like, okay, how to get clients, how to actually invoice people, like all these little things, how to sell, like Layla learned a ton that I'm sure has a huge ROI in what she's doing currently. But by year 3 of doing this type of work, Layla had over $200,000 in annual revenue. And again, she's an overqualified virtual assistant, so that's pretty darn good. But now, right, if you were to go look at Layla's services and go like, hey, where is that overqualified virtual assistant? Like, I'd love to hire Layla. You're gonna notice something completely different on the process-driven website. It's quite a bit different. Layla ends up making a pretty decently sized pivot in 2019. So here's Layla to explain.
So there's really like 3 chapters to the business so far. The first is that VA one, and I kind of lightly mentioned that I did some software setup then. I realized in that journey that that's something that people were really searching for and was really easy for me, just naturally, just very easy to set up Dubsados or Honeybooks or those kinds of things. And so chapter 2 was discovering this tool called ClickUp, who had just been founded around this time. And I had a lot of clients who were looking for task management set up. I was like, ooh, this new tool no one knows how to use. And so chapter 2 was me realizing, oh, well, if I specialize in a few tools, my setup goes a lot faster. I can be really good at it. And as you've gathered, I can start making content about it and start marketing in a different way. And so ClickUp was the first one onto the scene because I recognized kind of the blue ocean. They came of age just when I did. They're about the same age as my business. They had no real good content online about them, and there was demand. I could tell that it was a really good product and shitty at explaining what it does. And I had clients who were interested in that exact thing. So over time, I really kind of built up a reputation in the ClickUp space, or I think I did at least. Grew on YouTube. That really changed the business model into more leveraged offers. And eventually I came to realize, man, like ClickUp only serves a very small subset of users. It's kind of this quirky little tool that you need to be a real nerd to want to use. And so that's when Smart Suite got added into the mix because it's kind of a more database-y feature. And between the two of them, I could serve almost everybody that came to me because they are so complementary and just very different sides of the same market. So that was chapter 2. And then chapter 3, which is really where we're at now and we've been in since 2024, is kind of moving beyond all software and leading with the framework. And we've been translating now into multiple other tools. So we're in Notion now, we're in ClickUp, we're in Smart Suite, we're moving into Monday. Just expanding and leading with our approach to setting it up, how we structure things rather than any particular feature.
So as Layla mentioned, right, she moves process-driven into being like this overqualified virtual assistant into one particular tool, ClickUp, and then they have brought in the suite of tools and they work in from there. And that kind of process of like adding a tool and building up this suite of then tools that they work on, like that's worked out. Process-driven is now over 7 years old, which is much longer than her original plan of having it be a 2 to 3 year business, a 2 to 3 year MBA style business. But in that clip, Layla also mentions one concept that is really important. I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time. And that concept is blue ocean strategy. So blue ocean strategy, there's an entire book on it, but here's kind of like the short version of it. And I think it's actually really important for bootstrappers specifically. And blue ocean strategy is this concept of moving into a space where it's not a very competitive space. You want to be in a blue ocean where it's just like you, essentially. Like you're the unique, like you're the unicorn, essentially, right? You're a different kind of unicorn. You're not a unicorn that's a billion-dollar company. You're a unicorn that's like a category of one, as you'll hear in the kind of the blue ocean strategy world. And with this, that means like you're not in a red ocean or like a very competitive space where there's a bunch of people doing the same or very similar type of work. So like as Layla mentioned, right, if she was doing like Notion templates and Notion work, like there's a lot of different people doing Notion work, which isn't all bad, right? Notion's a pretty widely accepted tool. There's a lot of people using it, but there's a lot more competition in that space to go get clients and do all that kind of work. And red oceans tend to be where I would argue venture capital plays a big role because market share is a really big deal in red oceans. So, for example, for Uber and Lyft back in the day to exist, just to plain out exist and be there for the long haul, they needed to be venture funded to grow and beat all the other players in the space, right? Because if they were bootstrapping, like they couldn't have grown as fast and probably would have been like beaten out by the other players that were just straight up bigger than them. And they also had lower costs, they had more resources, they had more staff, right? So they needed to do like be venture backed because essentially they could subsidize their rides and they could just like get more and more users. And yes, like they're not profitable for years and years and years, but right now, right, you're seeing like the kind of like Uber and Lyft, right? They're still here. So if you're, I bet if we were to go into like a deep dive on like that space, right, those that weren't as well funded, I'm sure they're not doing as well. And that's partly because, right, like you just need the resources to grab market share. But for bootstrap companies, like living in blue oceans is probably your best case scenario because there's no market scarcity necessarily, and you're not competing against like really anyone in theory, right? You're again a category of one is what you'll hear. And you're just really focused on providing value to your customers. And there's an abundant amount of potential customers because there's no one else really in the space. It's just you and like the wide open blue, which also can be scary as well. With all of that, like how do you actually know that you have found a blue ocean worth being in? Well, here's Layla to explain how she found her blue oceans and how she approached it with the two tools she originally focused on, ClickUp and SmartSuite.
I like blue oceans. I don't like creating in crowded spaces. You'll never see me do a Notion tutorial. And so I went into SmartSuite tutorials and partnered with their team and just like went crazy on putting them into the marketplace. And it really, I think it did great things for them, but also for my clients because they got those early user deals and all those other things. So with ClickUp, complete risk. I just loved the product. Again, I had been looking at this space for a while and I was like, this product's so good, I think they're going to win. Super risky. You're so right. It's not a good choice for most people to just make those big bets. It worked out for me, but I don't know that it would for anyone else. So for ClickUp, I think I got lucky. For SmartSuite, I was in a much different position. At that point, off the top of my head, I would say we probably had 60,000 YouTube subscribers, probably had 1,500 clients or so that had gone through our program. Like I had a lot of market data at that point of what people were looking for. I had worked with so many ClickUp users who were trying to MacGyver it in to being a database tool. Like I had the short list of at least 20 people I know would need or would want, prefer an alternative. And so the second time, yes, it was a blue ocean, and I guess I should define that, just an area where it's not very crowded. There wasn't a lot of noise there. But I also had the personal relationships. And really, throughout this whole chapter, I feel like that's something I've come to really appreciate when it came to YouTube or other things. I would create YouTube videos for an actual client. Like that's how I created all my YouTube content. I created services when I knew somebody in my circle personally by name would buy it. And with SmartSuite, it was the same thing. I knew the people, and so it felt like a safer bet. It was a huge bet, but we were able to work it out. So I think knowledge of your people really matters.
So as Layla mentioned, you have to make some bets to figure out if you're in a blue ocean a lot of the time. But there are ways to do that, particularly with content, as Layla has found out. But with that in mind, let's move into the growth strategies of how Layla has grown ProcessDriven from zero to over $250,000 in annual revenue. Okay, if you're loving this deep dive so far, check out the Bootstrap report in the description of this episode where I put the data of 56 different Bootstrap businesses all into one report. Their growth strategies, how long it took them to get to 250K, and what the most popular growth strategies are for $250,000 businesses are all in there. Check it out in the description of this episode. Okay, as Layla mentioned, there's been 3 different chapters of ProcessDriven. There's the overqualified virtual assistant, the ClickUp and SmartSuite chapter, and now this framework for operations chapter. And Layla has done all 3 chapters essentially with only 2 different growth strategies. And the first growth strategy Layla used was relationships, and this one essentially built chapter 1 of ProcessDriven, the overqualified virtual assistant one. And Layla mentioned that she went to every single networking event she could. She used SCORE, which is the mentoring program funded through the US federal government for now. But just by going to these networking events and asking for referrals from her clients, like this led to Layla having over $200,000 in annual revenue by year 3. And this is pretty similar to a recent deep dive I did with Kyle and Blom of Silkscreen Marketing, where like, yes, he did a lot of cold outreach just by like showing up to these shops and things like that. but also, right, he went to a bunch of networking events, and yes, did that take a lot of time to really build up that kind of that network? Yes, but right, by year like 2 or 3, eventually, right, you have a pretty strong network, and that builds a really repeatable business. That gives you like a really nice income base if you build and meet the right people just at networking events, the local networking events. Layla's been in Pennsylvania and Salt Lake City, and Kylan has been in Holland, Michigan. So it's not like they're in New York or LA or these huge cities. They're in like these small towns, and they can build a pretty darn good business. Growth strategy number 2 is social media, or specifically YouTube. And this strategy has been the ones that have particularly fueled chapters 2 and 3 of ProcessDriven. And it's been really interesting. So starting in 2019, Layla started creating YouTube content videos based solely on ClickUp. And then eventually, right, you'll see that she added Smart Suite content. And then now, if you look at her content more today, it's more operational framework content on YouTube. So she's kind of broadened out over time, over the last 6 years or so. And what I've personally learned, and Layla's a great example of this, is that you can build a really great business by being focused just with YouTube content on one specific tool. Now, it can take a minute for videos to get going sometimes. So for example, if you look at Layla's videos on ClickUp or Smart Suite, yes, some have hundreds of thousands of views, but I would guess a ton of that traffic to these videos are driven by search on YouTube. How do I know this? Well, my own channel has benefited greatly from YouTube search, and that was around tools. My biggest video on my YouTube channel is the one about the best mobile no-code app builders. It has over 120,000 views, but the majority of those views came 6 months after I posted and have been primarily from search on YouTube. It was kind of just like 100 views for such a long time, and then all of a sudden it just like popped. And that's pretty much, it was just all YouTube search primarily. And yes, like algorithm kind of picked up as like search started picking up a little bit more too. But search has driven so much, and that's particularly because I was focused on tools. In Layla's content, you can see a bunch of other, if you just kind of look around YouTube, there's a lot of channels that are focused just primarily on tools, and they've built really nice businesses. Some of them are doing 7 figures in revenue just by doing like consulting and projects, and they don't even have that, like the content production level is like average. Like there's nothing fancy about them, but you can build a really nice business. And for me, like YouTube search has pretty much monetized my entire channel, like just by itself with one video. But then, right, like once you get going with YouTube and you start having a following like Layla, like she then can slowly creep out of those specific tools like she has done into more like broader content, which is paying off, as you'll see with her more SOP or standard operating procedures content. And Layla, I think, did this really, really smartly. So like if you look at kind of like her overall kind of videos, like over time, you'll see she was like really focused on ClickUp. And then all of a sudden she started experimenting a little bit here and there. So she would still keep the base of like ClickUp, but then it was more like, here's this like smart suite tool. Like, what do you think about that? Right? And that started helping her branch out. And right. And then, right, it wasn't really experiments anymore. It became like part of her foundation, Smart Suite did. And then, right, from there, she can do, okay, now I have Smart Suite, I have ClickUp, I have these different tools. But now let me do like experiments into more broader style operations content. And now that's starting to pay off, and that's now her foundational content. So if you can kind of like build your foundation from from really small and then grow with that, that's a really cool way to build a YouTube channel specifically and really build like a significant audience, which Layla has done. She's now over 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. That's Layla and ProcessDriven, how they've gone from 0 to over 250K in annual revenue. If you want to learn more about ProcessDriven, you can check out Layla on YouTube, but also check out her website at processdriven.co. If you found this episode helpful, I would love it if you can give it a like. And if you're looking for more content like this, check out the Bootstrap report in the description of this episode.